Walls. Sometimes they seem like a good idea. In our minds, walls keep us safe. They protect us. They keep bad things out. Think of the 3 little pigs. The one who built out of straw didn't last very long, and neither did the one who built out of wood. But the one who made that house out of bricks, he could withstand the big bad wolf. But that's a fairy tale. And in reality, walls don't really work. Walls separate people. Walls keep people from communicating with one another. And maybe worst of all, walls make people not equal. This unit is called Equality, and welcome again to Baden Hill Academy. This is a unit that will be a little bit different. It continues a series that started with fights, rights, and now equality, and the next unit will be eternity, and the first letters of those words spell out F-R-E-E, free. And in my mind, these 4 units pretty much sum up who we are as Americans and maybe as global citizens. So this unit is called Equality, and this first section is called Building Walls. It's kind of a general overview, and so it's going to be different from what we've done previously. We're not going to focus only on the 5 regions that we've been discussing. We have pretty much come up to the present day in places like Vietnam and even China. We will touch on those areas because our world is very interconnected, but I want to make sure that we're always looking at the big picture and not just building walls and dividing up the world nicely and neatly. So we'll start with some walls right here in the United States. And one of the most famous walls, it's not a physical wall, but it began after the Civil War had ended. In fact, you could even say it began after Reconstruction ended. The Reconstruction period lasted in the South from 1865 to 1877, when federal troops were finally withdrawn. And it was a compromise, and the idea was that black citizens would be allowed to live as Americans. The problem was that Southerners did not want to change their way of life. They did not want Northerners to tell them how to live. And so they began instituting black codes. And these codes were basically making black Americans slaves all over again. A very famous Supreme Court decision was passed down in 1896, and it's called Plessy v Ferguson. And remember, when we say versus in court cases, we just have a V, not VS period. It's just V period. So Plessy V Ferguson is a court case between Hiram Plessy and John Ferguson, who was a judge. And this happened starting in Louisiana. Now, many of the former Confederate states had these black codes, and Louisiana was a place where there was a lot of conflict between the many black Americans there and the white Americans or non-black Americans who did not want black Americans to be equal, and they didn't want to be pushed around by a federal government. And one of the main terrible events that took place shortly after the end of the Civil War was the New Orleans Massacre. We've discussed this briefly. It was basically a parade as the new Constitution was being designed for Louisiana, and it was a parade in New Orleans where black Americans and many white people who wanted to support their rights, they were marching down the street. They were peaceful, but they were attacked. And a kind of riot ensued, and the black people were chased away, or they were chased into one of the buildings in New Orleans, which is a very big building. It was called the Mechanics Institute. And There, many of them were massacred. They were killed, murdered, just for wanting equal treatment and wanting the Constitution to show that. And so that was in the past of Louisiana. And now in 1890, a new act was passed. It was called the Separate Car Act, and it basically instituted the idea that on a train, black people and white people had to travel separately. And the people in New Orleans and Louisiana who supported black rights, they were not happy with this. They saw this as an attack on the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution. And so a committee of citizens was organized, and they supported rights for black Americans. And what they did is they actually recruited Hiram Plessy, who was 1/8 African American. He was considered an octoroon, and he was 1/8 African American. So many people wouldn't even know that he had African American ancestry. And they recruited him to get on a whites-only car on the train. And they also hired a private investigator who would accuse him of breaking the law. And their thinking was, we want to push this so that Hiram Plessy gets arrested, and then it goes to trial or to the court. And the ruling then, it's going to go against Plessy, but it can be challenged and taken all the way up and up and up through appeals to the Supreme Court, and finally that law can be overturned. So it's very interesting that it was this committee of citizens who supported black rights who actually got this whole ball rolling. And so the court case was handed down finally in 1896 after Judge John Ferguson ruled against Plessy and said he had to pay a fine. That was appealed, and it made it to the Supreme Court. And the main justice, Henry Billings Brown, basically was the leader of the majority who decided 7-1. Notice it wasn't 9 justices back then. 7-1 against Plessy and in favor of Ferguson. And so a new policy was established that said those black codes were legal as long as the facilities that were created were equal quality. And so Plessy versus Ferguson led to what was called separate but equal. So you need to know both of those phrases in order to understand this situation. And that continued from 1896 all the way into the 1950s. This continued with the segregation of the government in 1913 by Woodrow Wilson, a real black mark on the character and legacy of a man who has many positive qualities, but we need to remember that he had racist inclinations. He was a Southern Democrat, even though he lived in the North later in his life. And so what happened is there was segregation. There was a separation of the races in the South. And it even kept black Americans from exercising their right to vote. What happened was taxes were placed on people in the South in order to vote. And the thing is, there were a lot of very poor white Americans, not just poor black Americans. But along with the poll tax that was established, meaning a tax that let you be able to vote, you had to pay a certain amount and then you could vote. Along with that was the idea of a grandfather clause. That meant that if your father or grandfather had voted, then it was okay. You didn't have to pay the poll tax. Well, of course, black Americans had never had fathers or grandfathers who could vote, but white Americans had. And as a result, the white Americans didn't have to pay the tax and they could vote, and fewer black Americans were allowed to vote through poll taxes. There were also registration exams that were literacy tests for registering to vote. You had to show that you could read and write in order to vote. And the same thing held true. If you had a father or grandfather who could vote, it didn't matter if you could read or write. They were grandfathered in. But Black Americans didn't have that situation. And so the literacy tests and also crazy tests on the knowledge of someone, they had to name every judge in the entire county or the entire state. And they had to do this from memory. And if you answered that first question correctly, well, they came up with another one. And so it was impossible. All of these laws separating Black and white Americans, they came to be known as Jim Crow laws. There was a song in the 1830s called Jump Jim Crow. And this song, Jump Jim Crow, was performed by a man named Thomas Rice in blackface. So he put on black shoe polish or makeup and tried to look like a black person, and it was to make fun of black people. It was actually, though, at the time, it was making fun of Andrew Jackson and his politics. It had nothing really to do with black people other than to say that the policies were foolish, just like a black person was made to look foolish. And so this is the beginnings of it. And these laws developed over the 1800s, separating black people and white people. And finally, after 1896, states started saying you must have separate facilities, especially in places like Florida. They had to have separate drinking fountains for black and white, separate bathrooms. Everything had to be separate. Now that sounds like it would cost a lot of money for the government to have two facilities instead of one. And that leads to why this could never be equal if it was separate. So you'll remember that Charles Sumner was actually beaten with a cane on the floor of the Senate by a representative in the House of Representatives. He was beaten by a man named Preston Brooks because Charles Sumner had insulted Preston Brooks's cousin related to Bleeding Kansas and the fight for slavery there. And so Charles Sumner was ready to get into battle, and he fought to bring races together. He fought for the Civil Rights Act of 1875. He died before it was passed, but even after it passed, and it was supposed to ensure that black and white people were treated equally in businesses and railroads and things like that, people basically ignored that Civil Rights Act of 1875 once Reconstruction ended and federal troops left the South. So the Mason-Dixon line, which is basically, west of Delaware and south of Pennsylvania and surrounds Maryland, and then basically Maryland and on south is the South. That Mason-Dixon line was a wall between North and South before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and it continued after the Civil War. Some people would even say it continues today. Blocks like this one. This is a piece of a wall, a block from a wall. The blocks that we will discuss have to do with walls, but it's actually BLOC that we'll be talking about, an eastern block, and then the western area of Europe after World War II. This was another wall that was developed because communism was spreading from the east, and Western Europe was being rebuilt by the Allies, Britain and France and the United States. Well, Winston Churchill gets credit for coining the phrase, the Iron Curtain. He said an Iron Curtain is falling between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. This was happening because when the Russian army was pushing from the east and the other allies were pushing from the west and converging on Germany and Berlin, they were actually racing. Even though they were both fighting on the same side, the Russians wanted influence, and they had a dream that, number one, that they would be safe, And making sure that Germany could never hurt them again was the way that they thought they could be safe. And they also wanted a buffer to protect them so that they would not easily be invaded. That is a very practical reason for Russia's advance. But they also wanted to spread communism. Now, Stalin, remember Stalin, who was Napoleon in Animal Farm? Stalin did have different ideas from Lenin and others like Trotsky. He believed that communism could function just within one country and develop within one country. So he didn't have the same expansionist ideas of other communists. But, when it came down to it, he was ready to spread his influence. And Russia took over Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, all the countries in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, Western Europe was being supported by the Marshall Plan. The United States government basically listened to General Marshall and invested in Europe to make sure that Europe wouldn't fall apart after the war and descend into anarchy or communism. And there was this feeling that governments could spring up that would be hostile to the United States. And so the Iron Curtain fell between the East and the West. Now, during this time, you also had another phrase, the fifth column. And the idea behind this was that people who looked like us could really be the enemy in disguise. And in the United States, there was this idea that you could have people who looked like ordinary Americans and supported democracy with their words, but in their hearts, they actually were communists. They were enemies, and they were trying to undermine the government. And so there was this fear. There wasn't only a fear of tanks coming from Eastern Europe, from Russia. There was also this idea that spies could invade the United States. And this led to this. This in my hand is a piece of the Berlin Wall. Now I'm going to come to this later. I'm actually going to have a segment dedicated to the Berlin Wall and everything that happened to make it, and looking forward to when it actually fell down or was torn down. And I got to be a part of that. And this is a piece of the Berlin Wall. So in Eastern Europe, the group of countries that were satellites of Russia were called the Communist Bloc, or the Eastern Bloc, and that's BLOC. And in the West, an accusation was made that the governments in Western Europe were puppets of the United States, because the United States really was the ally that had the strength after the war. Remember, the war really hadn't been fought in the United States, except for some territories in Hawaii. But the United States was strong after the war and became a world leader as a result. And so the countries that developed were seen as puppets obeying the United States. And in the East, those governments were puppets of the Soviet Union, Russia. In the United States, again, we had this idea that there was a menace. And this goes back to even before World War I. But, the idea when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, the idea was that there was a menace, that what was happening in Russia was going to spread all over the world. And there really were indications that communism was spreading. Kind of like when the French Revolution started spreading and everybody was following the ideas of these revolutionaries and Napoleon. So the red menace was on everyone's minds, and red meaning communist. But on the other side, if you look at it from the Soviet or communist perspective, they told their citizens that imperialists were trying to overthrow their government, which was a government by the people. Okay, they believed that communism was a people's government as opposed to the capitalist governments that were ruling Western Europe and the United States. And so they called Americans and those in Western Europe, they called them imperialist pigs. Okay, again, this is very ironic if you think of Animal Farm, okay, that the communist leaders were portrayed as pigs. But that is a phrase that is often used is imperialist pigs. The idea that you are greedy and take things for yourself. That was the view of capitalism. What ended up happening after the war then was that the United States realized that an alliance was necessary. And this sounds a lot like World War I, and we could start things all over again. But an alliance formed called NATO, and it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This organization was intended to defend Europe from attack. In response, the Soviet Union formed their own alliance. Again, it was a forced alliance because those governments and those people did not have free choice. They didn't have democratic elections. They were controlled by the Soviet army. But that group was called the Warsaw Pact. A pact is a promise or an agreement. So you had NATO in the west and the Warsaw Treaty or Pact in the east. In addition, you had organizations that were intending to protect the West and the East. And the United States has an organization in its government called the Central Intelligence Agency. And the CIA is known for collecting information about foreign governments and trying to keep America safe by sending people secretly abroad, spies. And sometimes the CIA was trying to undermine governments that were not friendly to the United States. And there were many crimes committed by the CIA, global crimes. There's no denying it. But on the other side, the Soviet Union had the KGB. The KGB was the spy agency for the Soviet Union. And so this was a time called the Cold War, when maybe the Soviet Union and the United States weren't shooting each other or launching missiles at each other, but the threat was constant and it kept building. And the idea was you had, like a chess game, you had to keep your pieces moving and you had to collect information about the other side and you had to strategize constantly. And so this was a period of spies, and the CIA and the KGB were a kind of dividing line. Now let's talk Berlin. Berlin was notorious. It was Hitler's capital. At the end of the war, the Allies knew that they could not allow Berlin to stay intact. They couldn't allow Germany to stay intact, and so they divided it up into 4 sectors based on the 4 biggest powers of the Allies. There was a French sector, a British sector, a US sector, and a Soviet sector. Remember, the Soviet Union was working together with Britain and the US and France. Well, Germany was divided into 4 sectors, and basically the northeast sector was the sector of Berlin, okay? And Berlin was in that sector, but it included a bigger area as well. And Berlin was also divided into 4. And so there was an eastern section of Berlin, which was the Soviet section. And then the other 3 sections basically joined together, the French, British, and US sections. They were West Berlin. East Berlin was Soviet. West Berlin was Western European, US. And that was the plan. It was designed so that Germany could be rebuilt and their government could be established with a democracy. And this had been agreed on at Yalta. But what happened was there was hostility between the communists and the non-communists. And as a result, those sectors became permanent. And you had a West Germany, and you had an East Germany. And in Berlin, which was in East Germany, you had Berlin, you had an East Berlin, and you had a West Berlin. That isn't going to work very well, especially because Berlin was inside East Germany. And so to get to Berlin, to get to the Western democratic, US-friendly side, you had to go through East German territory or Soviet territory. And so a corridor was established. It was a road. And that road went miles and miles and then came to Berlin. And for a while, from 1945 until 1948, things were working okay, but people were understanding that the tension was rising. It was known that the Soviet army was strengthening and basically not going to release the countries that it had taken over. And remember that atomic weapons had been developed, and the fear is that the Soviets are going to get that technology, and then they will be able to use it against democratic nations and take them over to become communist. So there's a lot of tension. Well, on June 24th in 1948, suddenly there was a sign on the road along that corridor to Berlin. And it said, because of technical difficulties, you can no longer use this road. Basically, Stalin had given the orders to close the corridor and starve Berlin. They wanted to starve West Berlin and make it collapse so that it would be a part of East Germany and would be a part of Soviet-controlled territory, and then it would be a victory for the Soviets. Well, that wasn't the end of the story. From June 24th forward, the Western European powers and the United States, they mobilized. And they began what was called the Berlin Airlift. So a U.S. Air Force general was put in charge of the operation, and his name was General William Tunner. So General Tunner was one of the heroes of the post-World War II period. He organized flights that would carry cargo to Berlin. Because remember, Berlin was basically under siege. West Berlin could not communicate, could not get food from countries that were friendly to this democratic portion of Berlin. And so General Tunner organized these flights, one after another, carrying cargo of milk and other goods, flour, things that could help the population of Berlin, millions of people. It would help them survive because they were truly under siege. And even though no war was going on, even though no conflict was openly declared between the Soviet Union and the U.S., these flights had to keep going to keep Berlin alive. And as the time went on, 1,500 flights were conducted every day, and each flight had 10 tons of food on it. And so it turned out that each day 5,000 tons were being delivered each day. And the record was 5 minutes and 40-some seconds to get all the cargo unloaded so that the plane that had landed in Berlin could take off. And so, every 5, 6, 7 minutes, a flight was landing in Berlin. And so that was the airlift to lift up Berlin and keep it alive for months and months, for almost a year. And finally, Stalin realized that his plan to starve and put a siege on Berlin, that didn't work. And it was a victory for Western democracy, and it was a sign that communism wasn't as overpowering as it seemed to be when it took over Eastern Europe. One quick story that I have to mention is a pilot named Gale Halvorson. and he was known as the Candy Bomber, or Uncle Wiggly Wings, or the Chocolate Uncle. He had many names, and it was because when he flew a flight and landed, he saw children in Germany, in Berlin, and he gave his 2 sticks of Wrigley's spearmint gum, or Doublemint gum, Wrigley's gum. He gave it to the children, and they divided it up, and it was so precious to them. And he said, wait a minute, okay, I have an idea. And so he started bringing in candy and dropping it into Berlin. And he had a signal. He would wiggle his wings, and so he became known as Uncle Wiggly Wings, and the Chocolate Uncle because he was dropping Hershey's chocolate bars. So that is another success story from the Berlin Airlift, Gail Halvorson, the Candy Bomber. The story of Berlin doesn't end there. It continues, and the tensions continue to rise and build. And West Berlin was actually becoming stronger and stronger because Western Europe was rebuilding. There was an economic miracle happening in Western Europe. And in the East, there had been some development, but it lagged behind the West. And by 1961, remember that President Kennedy had won the election of 1960, and so there was a sense that the United States was going to be hard on communism. And in Berlin, there was a sense that something had to be done, because what was happening is people in East Berlin didn't want to live there anymore. It wasn't as nice as West Berlin, and so they started leaving. And gradually, what happened is there were more and more restrictions on going between the sectors until almost overnight, a barrier was put up. Buildings were divided down the middle, and the windows were bricked up. And a no man's land was created because the government in West Berlin, the East Berlin government, the East German government, wanted to keep people from leaving, and so they created a wall. Now, it wasn't a cinder block wall. It wasn't this kind of wall yet. It took a while for that to be built. But that wall, that Berlin Wall, was a symbol of this division between communism in the East and democracy and freedom and capitalism and the dreams of improvement that were happening in the West. And so this Berlin Wall was a symbol, and President Kennedy visited Berlin in 1963, and he gave his famous speech because he caused the crowd to remember the Berlin Airlift, and that the United States would always support West Berlin and wanted Berlin to be one city again. And remember, the wall had gone up almost overnight, and it had actually divided families. Brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, parents and their children were divided. They could not visit each other. In fact, people who tried to leave after this point were shot. They were executed on the spot, and there were many victims as the guards who were guarding the Berlin Wall saw people trying to escape from East Berlin into West Berlin. They were shot. Now, President Kennedy went and he spoke. He spoke in English, but it was translated. And then he gave his famous phrase, "Ich bin ein Berliner," because he wanted the people to know that he was one of them. And he wanted to say, "I am a Berliner. I am a citizen of Berlin." But in German, that actually means, "I am a jelly donut." That's what he said. Just like a hamburger is a sandwich from Hamburg, a Berliner is a kind of pastry from Berlin, and everybody laughed a little bit, but they knew what he meant. Now, the conflict in Berlin continued all the way into the 1980s. As the Cold War developed and went through many phases, you had President Reagan elected in 1980, and then in the 1980s, there was a new leader in the Soviet Union named Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mr. Gorbachev was a proponent that the Soviet Union should change and should not have these walls everywhere. But the Berlin Wall was still there. And so President Reagan went to Berlin and he stood before the wall and he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And shortly after, about 2 years later, the Berlin Wall did come down. And so many people do give President Reagan credit for putting pressure on the Soviet Union. And finally, the Berlin Wall came down, starting in October and then November of 1989. And in 1990, I was able to go to Germany, and the Berlin Wall was no longer a barrier. People could go through very freely. You didn't have to have visas to get from one part of the city to the other part of the city. And people were tearing down the wall. They were chipping pieces off. Some of them had paint because the wall had been covered with graffiti. But there were pieces like this at the base of the wall. And one night I went with my friends and we were getting our pieces of the wall. And at that moment, one of my friends said, "Hey, that's Lex Luthor." He didn't say that exactly. He said, "That's Gene Hackman, a famous Hollywood actor. He was making a movie in Berlin." We were the only ones at the Berlin Wall that night. It was dark and late, and we were getting our souvenirs. And he was there, he was leaning on a sawhorse, and he was just watching, and we talked to him for quite a while. And it was a symbol to me that everyone was coming to Berlin because finally the Berlin Wall had come down. And so that's the story of Gene and me and how the Berlin Wall ceased to be. Now, these next couple of sections, I'm going to go through a little bit quicker. There's so much I could talk about. I've already mentioned a lot, but I want to talk about a different kind of wall in a different place. And this is a wall of water, and it separates Beijing and Taipei. Now, if you look at these names of cities, we know Beijing, it's the capital of the People's Republic of China. The capital of the Republic of China in Taiwan is Taipei, if you read the letters. Taipei, but it's actually Taipei, and it's the same bay as in Beijing. It means north. And the reason I mention this is because it shows how different Taipei and Beijing really are. Taipei is a democracy, it's capitalist, it's a free society. Beijing is capitalist, but they're not free. And who knows what will happen when the economy goes downhill and they have a recession or a depression there. After the United Nations acknowledged the People's Republic of China and basically expelled or accepted Taiwan's withdrawal from the UN, Taiwan just focused on its economy and building its own island, and there was a Cold War between Taiwan and mainland China. But gradually, starting with Deng Xiaoping, there were discussions and talks between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. And there were agreements that they would talk about one China. That even though there were two parts, that they would agree that they had a goal to reunite someday. And so the Republic of China, they could agree with that. They weren't going to reunite with communist China, but they would reunite with China someday if the communism was overthrown or the country changed dramatically. So on paper and in words, there was a one China policy. But because the People's Republic of China was hundreds of millions of people and Taiwan was only tens of millions of people, the influence of the PRC grew and grew and grew, and gradually countries that believed that Taiwan was the legitimate government, they started changing and deciding that the PRC was actually China and not Taiwan, and Taiwan lost allies, one after another. And so there was shrinking influence for the government of the Republic of China on Taiwan. And the leaders that had fled from mainland China, thinking that someday they would be able to go back and have their power again. They were getting older and older, and they would come to their meetings with oxygen tanks and in wheelchairs. And meanwhile, in the PRC, because of Deng Xiaoping's new economic policy, everything was changing, and China was growing. Well, that brings us to 2019. We see how powerful China can be. Even though China's economy is still number 2 behind the United States, everyone knows that eventually China's economy will pass the United States. I want to talk a little bit about Hong Kong, because Hong Kong, remember, was that British colony taken by force after the Opium Wars. And Hong Kong became a part of China again in 1997. And since that time, in the last 20 years, Hong Kong has lost any idea that it had a democratic government, because the British supported a democracy in Hong Kong and free trade and capitalism. Well, now the communist government is basically watching over everything in Hong Kong. It's still an economic power, but it doesn't have any sort of democracy that has any meaning. Another area that we need to pay attention to is the South China Sea, which is the area south of China. And in that area, in that sea, there are many tiny islands. Now, in the past, those islands were not very important. But recently, there have been explorations to find oil and natural gas and things that can be very, very profitable and valuable to China. And as those resources have been discovered, tiny islands have actually been used by China, and they've been built. So even places that were below the surface of the water, they were turned into islands. This has happened over the past 5 to 10 years. China has actually built islands out of coral reefs and things that are below the surface that can be turned into islands. And they have created runways on these islands so that they are not only places to drill for oil, but they are also military bases. And the world now sees that China can control not just China, but large areas around China that are close to Vietnam and the Philippines. And so there are conflicts between China and these other countries in the South China Sea. Now, China has 2 million people in its army. It has the biggest army in the world. The United States has 1.3 million. So we need to understand that this is an army that is largely volunteer, okay? It would be much bigger if it were really forced, and everyone who could be in the army had to be in the army. China is also developing new weapons, and they have a massive military budget. And so they are investing in technology and building their military, and they are also conducting espionage. That means they are sending spies all over the world. Remember that there were many, many foreign students from China sent into other countries and welcomed there because they had money to spend on a foreign education. Well, occasionally there are students who actually are sent from China to spy on other countries. And this has happened even in the United States. And it's something that is ongoing. And it's a realization that China is flexing its muscles. So they're building the 5G network that everyone will want. But it is believed that they can also use the 5G network for spying, to spy on everyday people and collect data. And the Chinese government is using technology to collect data on its own citizens. There are cameras everywhere. This is the new China, and they have money, and they're using it in specific ways to build walls. Finally, I want to talk about a wall that is similar to the segregation that has existed in the United States. And, we know that in the United States there is still segregation. The events of Ferguson, Missouri, where basically a young black man was killed by a white police officer. When that happened, there was a new movement called Black Lives Matter, and that spread all over the country and even internationally, the idea that racism and segregation in some form still exists. In South Africa, the policy of apartheid was overturned when democracy was finally established and the majority black population was able to elect the first black president who had been a prisoner under apartheid, and his name was Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela could have sought revenge. He could have wanted to get even with all of the white minority leaders who had been so cruel to black people over the decades. Instead, he was a wise man and he sought reconciliation. And there were actually trials that were reconciliation meetings where people came together to talk about the pain and the suffering and the damage that had been done, but not to punish in the ways of the past, not to put people in prison, but simply to talk about what had happened and how it needed to be solved. This was seen as very successful. Now, South Africa, unfortunately, has suffered greatly because of an epidemic of the AIDS virus, the HIV virus, which becomes the AIDS illness. And this is a disease that started in Africa and spread probably from a monkey to a human, but then through, from one human to another after that. And it came to the United States in the late 70s, early 1980s, and it was misunderstood for a long time. And people built walls between themselves and people who were suffering from AIDS because they were so afraid that they would contract or catch this disease from those people. And in South Africa today, it is awful. There are 7 million people who have AIDS, and it's 13% of the population. It's an unbelievable number of people, and places like Swaziland are also greatly affected because it's close to that area. And this is a disease that's still not under control, and there's much to be done, and it's still not understood properly. It's seen as, a disease of certain people and not us. So it's us versus them. That's a wall that's created. In addition, in South Africa, you have had an incredible drought over the past few years. The city of Cape Town, a major metropolitan area, almost ran out of water last July. And because of rain, it was spared for the time being. But there is despair because the resources there have not been used wisely. And even though South Africa is one of the richest resource countries in the world, with diamonds and gold that could be used properly, but there's corruption. Years and years of corruption. Even after Nelson Mandela was elected, he was a wise man and a good president, but his successor was corrupt. And there is currently an election to see if that corruption can finally be solved. And so there's massive debt in this country. There's a massive, massive debt. One thing that I want to end with, though, is the story of Invictus. And this is a movie directed by Clint Eastwood and starring Morgan Freeman as Nelson Mandela and a rugby team. And Matt Damon is the captain of the rugby team. And this rugby team is a white rugby team. And they have a new black president, and Nelson Mandela. And again, there could be tension, there could be problems, but instead, this South African rugby team has one black member on it, and this black member is a symbol of what's going on in the country and how reconciliation is happening. Well, this team, the South African team, wins the World Rugby Championship, and it was actually in South Africa. And so it was a symbol of a new South Africa. And I think that we need to remember those moments, even though they do pass and corruption returns and problems happen and droughts come. There is a way to tear down walls. Thanks for watching.